Restaurant manager kicked out disabled veteran. Then Navy SEALs at next table stood up. You need to leave. Now. The restaurant manager's voice cut through the peaceful Sunday afternoon like a knife, his finger jabbing toward the elderly man in the wheelchair. That table is for customers who actually spend money, not charity cases taking up space. If this incredible story of courage and brotherhood inspires you, please like and subscribe for more amazing tales that prove heroes still walk among us. 82-year-old Robert Bobby Harrison's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as his arthritic hands began to shake. The Purple Heart pinned to his faded navy jacket seemed to catch the harsh, fluorescent light as assistant manager Kyle Brennan loomed over his table clipboard, in hand and contempt in his eyes. I just ordered my lunch. Bobby stammered, his voice barely audible above the clatter of dishes and conversation from other tables. I've been coming here every Sunday for 4 years. This is my usual table. I don't care if you've been coming here since the Civil War. Old man Kyle sneered, his voice rising enough to draw stares from nearby diners. You sit here for 2 hours nursing 1 cup of coffee and a bowl of soup. That table could turn 3 times with real customers. Bobby's weathered face flushed with shame as conversations stopped and heads turned in their direction. His walker, positioned carefully beside his chair, bore the small American flag he'd attached years ago, a quiet symbol of pride that now felt like a target painted on his back. Please, son, Bobby whispered, reaching for his veteran's ID with trembling fingers. I have a military discount. I always tip 20%. I'm not causing any trouble. Trouble. Kyle's laugh was harsh and cruel. Look around, Grandpa. You are the trouble. Half-empty restaurant on a Sunday afternoon, and you're hogging prime real estate like you own the place. The plastic ID card slipped from Bobby's shaking hands and clattered to the floor, his service record and sacrifice reduced to a piece of litter at the feet of a man who had never worn a uniform. As Bobby struggled to lean down and retrieve it, his Purple Heart medal swinging forward, Kyle made his fatal mistake. Leave it, Kyle commanded. Just grab your walker and shuffle out of here before I call security. But from the corner booth, 3 men in civilian clothes had stopped eating entirely, their trained eyes taking in every detail of the confrontation unfolding before them. Their casual conversation had died mid-sentence, replaced by the kind of focused attention that comes from years of tactical awareness and an unshakable code of honor. Robert Harrison had never imagined that his golden years would be defined by such profound loneliness. After serving 26 years in the Navy, including 3 combat deployments during Vietnam, where he'd earned his Purple Heart pulling wounded sailors from a burning destroyer, Bobby had retired to Norfolk, Virginia, hoping to enjoy the quiet dignity he felt he'd earned through decades of service to his country. The transition from military to civilian life had been jarring enough when he was younger, and still had his wife Margaret by his side. But at 82, 3 years after Margaret's death from cancer, Bobby found himself navigating a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to the values that had shaped his life. His children lived across the country, busy with their own families and careers, and his modest Navy pension kept him comfortable, but isolated in a 1-bedroom apartment that echoed with memories of better days. Rosie's Diner had become Bobby's sanctuary, his one reliable connection to the outside world, beyond the walls of his apartment and the sterile corridors of the VA hospital where he received his medical care. Located just 15 minutes from the massive naval station Norfolk, Rosie's had always attracted a steady stream of active duty personnel, military families, and veterans like Bobby who found comfort in the familiar rhythms of military life that surrounded the base. The original owner, Rose Martinez, had been a Navy wife who understood the unique challenges faced by military families. She'd created an atmosphere where uniforms were respected, where deployed spouses could find community, and where retired veterans could maintain their connection to the brotherhood that had defined their lives. Rose had known Bobby's order by heart: tomato soup, grilled cheese sandwich, and black coffee, and she'd always made sure he had his preferred table by the window where he could watch the Norfolk skyline and remember the young sailor he'd once been. Bobby's Sunday routine had evolved into something sacred over the past 4 years. He'd arrive at exactly 1:00 p.m. after the lunch rush, but before the dinner crowd when the restaurant was quiet enough for conversation, but busy enough to make him feel part of something larger than his solitary existence. The waitresses had learned to give him time to eat slowly, his arthritis making every movement deliberate, and regular customers had grown accustomed to seeing the elderly veteran in his corner table American flag pin on his walker and Purple Heart on his jacket. But everything changed when Rose sold the diner to a regional restaurant chain 8 months ago. The new corporate management brought efficiency experts, profit optimization, consultants, and assistant managers like Kyle Brennan, a 26-year-old business administration graduate who saw customers as data points rather than human beings with stories worth honoring. Kyle had been vocal about his plans to modernize operations and eliminate low-value customer segments that didn't meet corporate profitability standards. He'd already removed the military memorabilia that had decorated the walls, implemented strict time limits for table occupancy, and instructed staff to prioritize younger customers who were more likely to order multiple courses and alcoholic beverages. The Sunday that shattered Bobby's world began with an ominous sign he should have recognized. His usual table by the window was occupied by a family of tourists, and the hostess, a new hire who didn't know Bobby's routine, had seated him at a small table near the kitchen entrance, where the constant traffic and noise made it difficult to enjoy the peaceful meal he'd come to cherish. Bobby had accepted the change with the quiet grace that military service had taught him, understanding that flexibility and adaptation were survival skills that served him well in civilian life. He'd ordered his usual meal and settled in with the newspaper. He always brought content to make the best of the situation, while hoping his regular table would be available the following week. The first sign of trouble came when Kyle Brennan emerged from the back office, tablet in hand, conducting what he called a customer efficiency audit. Bobby had noticed the young manager during previous visits watching diners with the calculating gaze of someone measuring value in dollars and cents rather than human dignity. Kyle had made notes, timed table turnover rates, and held whispered conferences with servers that always seemed to focus on the older customers who ate slowly and ordered modestly. Mr. Harrison, Kyle had said, approaching Bobby's table with the false smile that corporate training had taught him to deploy when delivering unwelcome news. "I hope you're enjoying your meal today." Bobby had looked up from his soup, immediately sensing something wrong in the manager's tone and body language. "It's fine, thank you. Though I do miss my usual table by the window." "Yes, about that." Kyle had continued, his smile growing more strained. "I've been reviewing our seating algorithms and customer flow patterns, and I think we need to discuss your dining habits here." The word algorithms hit Bobby like a physical blow. In all his years of dining out, through decades of being welcomed and appreciated for his service, no one had ever reduced his presence to a mathematical equation. "I'm sorry, what exactly are you saying?" Kyle's corporate facade began to crack as he launched into his prepared speech. "Mr. Harrison, our data shows that your average visit duration is significantly above optimal turnover metrics. You typically occupy a table for 90 to 120 minutes while generating minimal revenue per seat hour." Bobby felt his cheeks burn with shame and confusion. "I don't understand. I always pay my bill. I tip well. I've never caused any problems." "It's not about problems," Kyle replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. "It's about maximizing operational efficiency. That table you prefer by the window, it's prime real estate that could generate 3 times the revenue with customers who order appetizers, entrees, desserts, and beverages." The suggestion that his 4 years of loyal patronage meant nothing compared to hypothetical customers who might spend more money was devastating to Bobby. "This place has always been welcoming to veterans. Rose herself told me I'd always have a home here." "Rose doesn't own this establishment anymore." Kyle snapped, his false politeness finally evaporating completely. "I manage operations now, and I'm responsible for meeting corporate profitability targets. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills." That's when Bobby made his crucial mistake. Instead of quietly accepting the humiliation and finding somewhere else to eat, he decided to stand his ground. "I'd like to speak to the general manager about this." Kyle's face hardened with the authority of someone unused to being challenged. "I am the manager on duty, and I'm telling you that we need to optimize your seating arrangement. You can finish your meal at the counter if you'd like, but this table is needed for customers who contribute meaningfully to our bottom line." The confrontation escalated when Bobby, drawing on reserves of dignity forged in the crucible of military service, refused to be relegated to eating at the counter like a second-class citizen. "Son, I've been coming here every Sunday for 4 years. I've never been treated like this, and I don't intend to start now. Kyle's response revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about who he was dealing with. Look, Mr. Harrison, I understand you're set in your ways, but this is a business, not a senior center. We cater to a diverse customer base, and we can't accommodate every individual preference. Individual preference. Bobby's voice carried a note of steel that Kyle was too inexperienced to recognize as dangerous. Is that what you call treating a paying customer with basic respect? The young manager's corporate training had never prepared him for dealing with someone who had faced down enemy fire and emerged with both his honor and his spine intact. Kyle doubled down on his authority, raising his voice enough to draw attention from nearby tables. Sir, I'm going to need you to cooperate with our seating policies or I'll have to ask you to leave. This isn't negotiable. Bobby's hands trembled as he reached for his wallet, not from fear, but from a rage so pure it reminded him of the moment he'd watched his shipmates die in the South China Sea. Here's my veteran's discount card. I've been using it here for 4 years, without any problems. Kyle barely glanced at the card. Your military service is appreciated, but it doesn't entitle you to special treatment or exemptions from our operational requirements. The casual dismissal of Bobby's service, the reduction of 26 years in uniform, 3 combat deployments, and a Purple Heart to a simple appreciation that carried no weight in Kyle's profit calculations, was the final insult. Bobby felt something break inside him that had nothing to do with his arthritic joints or his aging body. Special treatment. Bobby's voice cracked with emotion. I'm asking for the same treatment I've received here for 4 years. The same table, the same meal, the same basic courtesy that any paying customer deserves. Kyle's response was to pull out his phone and begin timing Bobby's remaining meal consumption. Mr. Harrison, you've been at this table for 47 minutes. Corporate policy allows a maximum of 60 minutes for single-course orders. I'm giving you 13 minutes to finish and vacate. The humiliation was complete. Bobby, a man who had commanded respect from subordinates and superiors alike during his military career, was being treated like a problem to be managed rather than a human being deserving of dignity. As he struggled to eat his soup with hands that shook from emotion rather than age, he became aware that other diners were watching the confrontation with a mixture of embarrassment and outrage. That's when he noticed the 3 men in the corner booth. Unlike the other customers who were trying to pretend they weren't witnessing his humiliation, these 3 were watching with the focused attention of professionals assessing a tactical situation. Their civilian clothes couldn't disguise the military bearing that marked them as clearly as if they'd been wearing uniforms. The short haircuts, the straight postures, the way they positioned themselves to maintain visual contact with all entrances and exits. Bobby recognized the look immediately. These were warriors and they were not pleased with what they were witnessing. The lead man was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of leading others through dangerous situations. His companions flanked him with the practiced coordination of a team that had worked together under pressure. When Kyle continued his public humiliation of Bobby checking his watch and making notes on his tablet, the 3 men exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their assessment of the situation. The moment that changed everything came when Kyle, emboldened by Bobby's apparent compliance and the lack of intervention from other customers, decided to make an example that would discourage other low-value patrons from testing his authority. He approached Bobby's table with his tablet prominently displayed, speaking loudly enough to ensure his words carried throughout the restaurant. Mr. Harrison, your time is up. I need you to settle your bill and vacate this table immediately. We have a party of 6 waiting for seating, and they represent the kind of customers we're trying to attract. Bobby looked up from his half-finished soup, his Purple Heart medal catching the light as he struggled to process the public nature of his dismissal. I still have soup left, and I haven't finished my sandwich. You can take it to go, Kyle replied dismissively. Our takeout containers are perfectly adequate for customers who need extended time to consume their meals. The suggestion that he should finish his Sunday meal standing at his car in the parking lot was the final straw. Bobby's military training had taught him when to retreat and when to make a stand, and something in Kyle's arrogant tone triggered every instinct he'd developed during his years of service. Son, Bobby said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded sailors in combat, I'm going to finish my meal at this table, and then I'm going to pay my bill and leave. but I'm not going to be rushed or humiliated by someone who clearly doesn't understand the first thing about treating customers with respect. Kyle's face flushed red with anger at being challenged in front of his staff and customers. That's it. You're trespassing now. Either you leave voluntarily or I call security to have you removed. That's when the three men in the corner booth stood up simultaneously, their movement so coordinated and purposeful that it drew immediate attention from everyone in the restaurant. The lead man approached with the measured stride of someone accustomed to taking charge of volatile situations, his companions flanking him in a formation that spoke of years of tactical training. "Excuse me," the man said to Kyle, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people stop what they were doing and listen. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with this gentleman, and I think there might be a misunderstanding here." Kyle turned, clearly annoyed by the interruption and unaware that he was about to face opponents far more formidable than an elderly veteran eating soup. "This is a private matter between management and a customer. I'll need you to return to your table." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Actually, I think this became everyone's business the moment you decided to publicly humiliate a decorated war veteran for the crime of eating slowly." Bobby looked up at his unexpected defender, taking in the bearing the haircut the way the man's companions had positioned themselves to control the space around Kyle. These weren't just military. They were special operations, the kind of elite warriors Bobby had worked with during his own servicemen, who understood that honor wasn't just a word, but a code that governed every aspect of their lives. "I don't know who you think you are," Kyle sputtered, "but I'm the manager here, and I have the authority to manage seating arrangements as I see fit." "You're absolutely right," the man replied calmly. "You do have that authority. What you don't have is the right to abuse it by targeting a veteran who's done nothing wrong except failed to meet your arbitrary spending requirements." The turning point crystallized as Kyle realized he was no longer dealing with one isolated elderly man, but with a coalition of current military personnel who had witnessed his behavior and found it unacceptable. The balance of power in the restaurant had shifted completely, and Kyle was about to learn that some battles cannot be won through corporate policy and bureaucratic authority. The lead man knelt beside Bobby's table with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to checking on wounded comrades under fire. "Sir, I'm Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, United States Navy SEALs. These are my teammates, Senior Chief Petty Officer Davis and Petty Officer First Class Martinez. We'd be honored to know your name and service record." Bobby felt tears prick his eyes at the simple gesture of military courtesy. "Hospital Corpsman First Class Robert Harrison, retired. 26 years, 3 deployments to Vietnam. And I'm grateful for your intervention, Commander." "The honor is ours, Corpsman," Senior Chief Davis said, his voice carrying the gravelly authority of a man who had spent 2 decades turning civilians into sailors. "Any man who wore the caduceus in combat has our deepest respect." Kyle, sensing that the situation was spiraling beyond his control, tried to reassert his managerial authority. "Look, I don't care if you're Navy SEALs or Navy Beans. This is my restaurant, and I make the operational decisions. This gentleman is violating our seating efficiency protocols." Lieutenant Commander Webb stood slowly, his 6'2" frame unfolding with the controlled power of a weapon being readied for action. "Your restaurant. That's interesting because I was under the impression that this establishment was built on serving the military community that keeps the city running." "Times change," Kyle replied, but his voice lacked the confidence he'd displayed when confronting Bobby alone. "We have to adapt to modern business realities. Sentiment doesn't pay the rent." "Modern business realities?" Petty Officer Martinez repeated, his tone suggesting he was tasting something unpleasant. "Is that what you call disrespecting a Purple Heart recipient who just wants to eat his lunch in peace?" Kyle made the mistake of trying to justify his position by doubling down on corporate policy. "Our customer analytics clearly show that extended table occupancy by single diners reduces overall revenue potential. It's simple mathematics." "Mathematics," Senior Chief Davis said, stepping closer to Kyle with the kind of presence that had intimidated countless recruits during his years as an instructor. "Let me give you some mathematics, son. This man served 26 years protecting your right to run your mouth. He earned a Purple Heart, which means he bled for this country while you were probably still in diapers. And you think his value can be calculated on a spreadsheet?" The confrontation drew the attention of other diners, many of whom began pulling out their phones to record the scene. Kyle, realizing that his treatment of Bobby was being documented for social media, tried to moderate his tone while maintaining his position. I respect his service, but this is a business establishment with operational requirements. We can't make exceptions for every individual circumstance. Lieutenant Commander Webb pulled out his own phone and began recording. Mr. Harrison, would you mind sharing your service record for our viewers? I think people should know exactly who this manager considers an individual circumstance. Bobby's voice grew stronger as he spoke about his deployments, his Purple Heart, his years of treating wounded sailors and Marines in field hospitals throughout Southeast Asia. With each word, Kyle's face grew paler as he realized that the video would soon be viewed by thousands of current and former military personnel who would not look kindly on his treatment of a decorated veteran. This is harassment, Kyle protested weakly, but his objection carried no weight in a room full of people who had witnessed his behavior firsthand. No, Lieutenant Commander Webb replied. This is accountability. You wanted to make an example out of Corman Harrison. Now we're making an example out of you. The situation escalated when other customers began approaching Bobby's table to express their support. A young Marine Lance Corporal stood at attention and rendered a perfect salute, followed by an elderly Air Force veteran who placed his hand on Bobby's shoulder and shared his own story of service during the Korean War. The restaurant was transforming into an impromptu gathering of the military community united in their defense of one of their own. Kyle found himself surrounded by a growing circle of current and former service members, all of whom had witnessed his treatment of Bobby, and none of whom were inclined to let it pass without consequence. The manager, who had felt so powerful when confronting one isolated elderly man, now looked like what he was: a small person who had made the mistake of attacking someone who belonged to a brotherhood that never abandoned its own. The situation reached a critical point when Kyle, realizing his authority was completely undermined, made a desperate attempt to regain control by threatening to call the police. This is harassment and intimidation. I'm calling law enforcement to have all of you removed for disturbing the peace. Lieutenant Commander Webb's response was swift and decisive. Please do. I'd love to explain to them why you're harassing a Purple Heart recipient for eating too slowly. I'm sure they'll be very interested in your customer service philosophy. Kyle's hand trembled as he reached for his phone, but before he could dial, the restaurant's general manager, Sarah Chen, arrived after being summoned by a server who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Chen herself, a Navy veteran who had served 2 deployments in Afghanistan, took one look at the scene and immediately understood what had happened. Mr. Brennan, she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from combat leadership experience. Step away from this table immediately. Kyle turned to his superior with relief, expecting support for his position. Sarah, thank God you're here. These people are interfering with restaurant operations and threatening me for enforcing corporate seating policies. Sarah Chen's expression grew colder as she took in the full scope of the situation. An elderly veteran surrounded by active duty SEALs, other military personnel gathering in support, and phones recording every moment of the confrontation. Mr. Brennan, you're suspended pending investigation. Report to the office immediately. Suspended, Kyle's voice cracked with disbelief, for enforcing company policy, for trying to maximize table turnover and revenue generation, for creating a public relations disaster and violating every principle this restaurant was built on? Chen replied firmly. This establishment has served the military community for over 30 years. The fact that you don't understand that tells me everything I need to know about your fitness for management. Kyle's desperation made him reckless. You can't suspend me for doing my job. Corporate headquarters specifically instructed us to eliminate low-value customers who don't meet spending thresholds. This man, he pointed at Bobby, is exactly the kind of customer we're supposed to discourage. The admission that Bobby's treatment was part of a deliberate corporate strategy to exclude veterans and elderly customers sent a wave of anger through the assembled military personnel. Senior Chief Davis stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over Kyle. So this wasn't just your personal decision. This was company policy to target veterans. Kyle, realizing he had revealed more than he intended, tried to backtrack. It's not specifically about veterans. It's about optimizing customer value across all demographic segments. Demographic segments. Petty Officer Martinez repeated, his voice heavy with disgust. You turned a war hero into a demographic segment. Lieutenant Commander Webb addressed Sarah Chen directly. Ma'am, I assume you weren't aware of Mr. Brennan's interpretation of corporate policy? Chen's face was grim as she responded. I can assure you, Commander, that neither I nor the ownership of this restaurant would ever condone the treatment you've witnessed today. This establishment has always honored those who serve, and it always will. The climactic moment came when Kyle, facing the end of his career and the public exposure of his actions, made one final attempt to justify his behavior. Fine, you want to turn this place into a charity for old soldiers, go ahead. But don't blame me when profits tank because you're catering to people who order soup and sit for 2 hours. The collective gasp from the assembled crowd was audible. Kyle had just dismissed not only Bobby's service, but the sacrifice of an entire generation of veterans as a drain on corporate profits. Bobby Harrison, who had remained quietly dignified throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. His voice was soft but carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. Son, I didn't spend 26 years in the Navy so you could reduce my service to a line item on a profit and loss statement. I didn't watch good men die so you could treat their sacrifice as a business inconvenience. The final confrontation erupted when Kyle, his career in ruins and his actions exposed to the world, made one last desperate attempt to justify his treatment of Bobby Harrison. You want the truth? Here's the truth. This old man represents everything wrong with this business. He takes up space orders, the cheapest items on the menu, and expects special treatment because he fought in some war 50 years ago that nobody cares about anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Kyle had just revealed the ugly core of his worldview. That military service was ancient history, that sacrifice had an expiration date, and that a Purple Heart recipient's worth could be measured solely by his restaurant spending. Lieutenant Commander Webb stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. Mr. Brennan, I want you to understand something very clearly. That old man you're dismissing served his country with honor while you were still a gleam in your father's eye. That war nobody cares about cost 58,000 American lives, including friends and shipmates of the man you just insulted. Kyle's response revealed the full extent of his disconnect from the values that had built the community around him. I don't care about ancient history. This is 2023, and we're running a business, not a museum for old soldiers who can't accept that the world has moved on. That's when Bobby Harrison himself stood up, his walker, supporting his frail frame, but his voice carrying the strength of a man who had faced death and emerged victorious. The Purple Heart on his jacket caught the light as he addressed Kyle directly. Son, let me tell you about that war you think nobody cares about. I was 22 years old when our destroyer took a direct hit from a North Vietnamese torpedo boat. I spent 6 hours in the water pulling wounded sailors to safety while enemy gunfire tore up the sea around us. I lost 3 fingers and took shrapnel in both legs, but I got 17 boys home to their families. Bobby's voice grew stronger as he continued. That Purple Heart you're so dismissive of, I earned it by refusing to leave wounded men behind. Those ancient values you mock, they're the reason you have the freedom to stand here and insult the people who bought it with their blood. Kyle's final mistake was to interrupt Bobby's testimony. Save the war stories for the VFOW, old man. This is a restaurant, not a therapy session. The explosion of anger from the assembled military personnel was immediate and overwhelming. Senior Chief Davis had to be physically restrained by his teammates, while other veterans shouted their outrage at Kyle's dismissal of Bobby's service and sacrifice. But it was Sarah Chen who delivered the final blow, her voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of command. Mr. Brennan, you're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises, and you are permanently banned from this establishment. Kyle Brennan was removed from Rosie's Diner by security, his termination becoming the least of his worries as videos of his confrontation with Bobby Harrison spread across social media platforms. Within hours, his treatment of the elderly veteran was trending on Twitter. His dismissive comments about military service were being shared by veteran support groups, and his prospects for future employment in hospitality management had evaporated. Sarah Chen, working with Lieutenant Commander Webb and the other military personnel present, immediately implemented comprehensive changes to honor and support veteran customers. The restaurant established Bobby's Table, the window seat where Bobby had eaten for 4 years, as a permanent memorial to all veterans with a brass plaque reading, "Reserved for those who served." Bobby was given lifetime dining privileges and became the unofficial greeter for other veterans who visited the restaurant. The corporate response was swift and decisive. The parent company issued a public apology, donated $100,000 to veteran support organizations, and mandated military appreciation training for all management personnel. Sarah Chen was promoted to Regional Operations Director, and Rosie's Diner became the flagship location for the company's new veteran outreach program. Bobby Harrison found his life transformed from isolation to community leadership. The restaurant became a gathering place for military personnel who wanted to honor his service and hear his stories. Local Navy commands began bringing new recruits to meet Bobby, using his example to teach the values of service and sacrifice that define military culture. Lieutenant Commander Webb and his team made Bobby's story part of their own mission, using their platform to highlight the challenges faced by aging veterans and the importance of honoring those who had served. Their intervention had saved more than Bobby's dignity. It had reminded an entire community of the debt owed to those who had sacrificed for freedom. The impact extended far beyond one restaurant. Bobby's story inspired similar policy changes at businesses throughout the Norfolk area, creating a network of veteran-friendly establishments that understood the true meaning of service. The elderly corpsman who had been dismissed as a low-value customer became a symbol of honor and resilience, proving that some values cannot be measured in profit margins. 1 year later, Kyle Brennan returned to Rosie's Diner, not as a manager but as a volunteer serving meals to homeless veterans. His encounter with Bobby Harrison had forced him to confront his own values and priorities, leading to a painful but necessary transformation. He would never again see veterans as statistics or service as ancient history, having learned that true worth cannot be calculated in dollars and cents. Bobby Harrison continued his Sunday visits to Rosie's Diner, but now he was never alone. His table became a gathering place for warriors of all generations, a reminder that service to country creates bonds that transcend time, rank, and circumstance. In defending one elderly veteran, the Navy SEALs had honored them all, proving that the brotherhood forged in service never truly ends.